Hi, hello, good afternoon. My name is Aparna and you're here with me for your science class for today. Now, what are we talking about in today's class? In today's class, we're going to talk about the cell. Now, when you hear the word cell, what is the image that comes to your mind? Perhaps something along the lines of this? If it is, then you're not wrong. But the cell that we're talking about is a little bit different. Now, before I give you the details of the cell, I'm going to take you through everything, the points, the different points that we're going to go through in today's class. Now, today's class, we're going to talk about the cell, what the cell is, and why it is known as it is. We're going to talk about who discovered the cell and the circumstances that led to the discovery, one of the greatest discovery in the whole of biology. We're going to talk about the differences, the variety in sizes and shapes exhibited by the cells, by the different kinds of cells in nature. We're going to talk about the differences in organisms, whether they be big or small, how the cells in them vary. We're going to talk about the different kinds of organisms based on their cellular organization, from single cells to multiple cells, to millions and trillions of cells. And then we're going to talk about the structure of the cell. And we're going to talk about the outermost covering of the cell, what we know as a cell membrane or the plasma membrane. Now, it seems like there's a lot to talk about about the cell, isn't there? So, let's get started with the question, what is a cell? Quite simply put, a cell is the basic functional unit of life. Now, what does that mean? Why is it known as the basic functional unit of life? Let's take another example. We've learned in chemistry how atoms make up all matter in the entire universe. Just like that, all living beings in this entire world that we know of, all living beings, starting from a bacteria or a virus to beings like us, human beings, or the blue whale, the largest living creature known to man. All of these living beings are made up at their lowest level of organization of cells. Now, I'm going to take you to a video that will show you in a little bit more detail exactly why a cell is the basic level of organization, or rather, how we can understand how the cell becomes the basic unit of life.
Both the living and non-living are composed of atoms and molecules. The organization of these molecules into cells distinguishes living things from all other matter. The bricks in a building and cells.
Isn't that an interesting video? We saw how just like a huge house or a huge apartment complex or any building, any structure is made up of tiny, small bricks stacked together. Just like that, all living matter, all beings, the body of all organisms are made at the smallest level of cells. Different kinds of cells, different types of cells stacked together to form the entire organism. Now, before we talk about the cell in detail, let's take a short look at the discovery of the cell. Now, when we look at the discovery of the cell, we can say that the cell was discovered in the year 1665. Pretty old, isn't it? By a scientist called Robert Hooke. Now, Robert Hooke, what did he do? He took a thin slice of cork cells. cork cells and he put them under a microscope. Now in 1665, we didn't have the kind of sophisticated electron microscopes that we have today. Rather, he had a very primitive form of microscope. And what he saw through his microscope, the cork cells that he saw, the image he got was something like this. Now, when you look at this image, what is it that strikes you? What I see here is a honeycomb-like structure of small boxes having definite boundaries. Now, Robert Hooke called each of these tiny little boxes as a cell. A cell in Latin basically means a small room. So he called each of these a cell. And later scientists came about, they did more research into the cell, and they found out the different characteristics, the different properties, and a lot of all the information about the cell that we have today were later found out from the point that Robert Hooke gave us, from the beginning that Robert Hooke gave us. Now, we've talked about cells, we've talked about the different kinds of beings, and we've said that all living organisms are made up of cells. And we've also said how from bacteria or virus to the blue whale, all organisms are made up of cells. That means that the cell structure varies from a single cell, an organism that has one single cell as its body, for example, something like amoeba, to something as vast, as complex as a human being who has trillions and trillions of cells in their body. Now, I'm going to take you to another video which will show you exactly how diverse life is on this earth and how this diversity is accentuated through the cells that we have.
A unicellular organism such as amoeba captures and digests food, respires, excretes, grows, and even reproduces. Similar functions in multicellular organisms are carried out by different systems. We know that systems are made up of different organs, and organs are made up of different kinds of tissue. The tissues in turn are made up of specialized cells. A multicellular organism requires a huge number of specialized cells.
So what did we see in the video? We started with the amoeba, and we saw how the entire body of the amoeba consists of one single cell. But the amoeba is not all that bad. In fact, it's a pretty smart being, because that entire cell, the entire body, which consists of one cell, has the ability to carry out the entire range of biological functions that any living being is capable of. For example, that one cell can carry out nutrition, digestion, respiration, reproduction, excretion, growth, that the entire range and variety of biological processes that any living being is capable of is done by that one single cell in the case of amoeba. Now let's look at the other end of the scale. At the other end, we have a multicellular organism. Now, what is a multicellular organism? Any organism that has more than one cell as its body is known as a multicellular organism. And one of the prime examples is us, human beings. Now, how are these functions, the biological functions that we saw in an amoeba, carried out in a multicellular organism? In a multicellular organism, these cells are differentiated into tissues. Tissue is a group of similar cells performing a special function. A group of cells come together, they join together to perform a function, and they're known as a tissue. Now these tissues in turn join together, come together to form organs. Organs. What are the organs that we know of in our body? We've heard of the lungs, the brain, the eyes, and we know of the different the organs we have in the body. And these organs come together to form organ systems. The human body has 11 organ systems, and I'm sure we've learnt about some of them. For example, we've probably heard of the circulatory system, the muscular system, the skeletal system, the nervous system. These are some of the systems that we may have heard of or we may be familiar with. And all of these systems carry out specific functions in the body. For example, the skeletal system gives us our shape and it allows us to move, while the nervous system is responsible for transmission of messages from the brain, which is the control center, to different parts of the body. And each of these systems have their specific functions which they carry out. Now we've looked at the different kinds of organisms and how the difference is accentuated by the number of cells they have. So that gives rise to the question of size of cells. Now, what is generally the size of a cell? That actually depends upon the cell itself, the function it carries out. For example, let's talk about an elephant and a tiny little rat. Most of us may have the question of, doesn't it mean that just because an elephant is a huge animal, does it not mean that it has big cells? Shouldn't the size of the cell be big just because the organism is big? The answer to that question is no, not really. Just because the size of the organism has nothing to do with the size of their cells. The size of the cells depends solely upon the function that it carries out in the body of the organism. For example, let's take the nerve cells of the elephant and of the tiny little rat. When we compare them, we find that there's not much difference in their cell structure or in the size of their cell. So from this we can see that the cells don't really depend on the organism for their size, but rather on the specific functions that they carry out. Now let's look at the different kinds of, we've seen the different kinds of sizes of cells, but what about the different kinds of shapes of cells? Let's look at the different kinds of shapes, the different kinds of cells that we have in the human body. And before we talk about the different kinds of cells we have, let's take a look at this video that will give you a little bit more idea what the different kinds of cells we have and the shapes that they belong to.
Multicellular organisms such as human beings have trillions of cells, which vary in shape. Normal red blood cells are disc-shaped. However, they are highly flexible and can also change their shape so that they can pass through tiny capillaries. On the other hand, the muscle cells are elongated. The nerve cells are usually long and branched. Why do these cells have different shapes? The shape of the cells is related to their specific functions. Round red blood cells can flow smoothly through the blood vessels. Elongated muscle cells help in the movements of the skeleton and internal organs. The nervous system controls and coordinates the working of different parts of the body with the help of the nerve cells that are highly branched and elongated. Now, which part of a cell gives it a particular shape? Let us take an example, a single cell which can be seen easily. Yes, an egg. The cell's components are enclosed in a cell membrane. This cell membrane provides shape to the cells of plants and animals.
we've seen the different kinds of organisms based on the number of cells they have. Now, that probably gives rise to the question of the size of the cell. Now, how big is the cell? Well, the size of the cell actually depends on the function that it carries out in the body. Let's take a huge, big elephant and a tiny little rat, and let's compare their cells. For example, let's take the nerve cells or the neurons. Now, you would expect that in a big elephant, the cells would be really, really big, and that a small little rat would have much smaller cells. But the actual reality is a little different. When we compare the size, the nerve cells, for example, of the elephant and the rat, we find that they are quite similar both in their structure and in their shape. So this means that the size of the organism itself does not really have much of a bearing on the size of their individual cells. The size of the cell depends not on the size of the organism, but on its particular function, on the function it serves in the body. Now, let's look at the biggest cell. What do you think is the biggest cell known to man today? We know that one of the visible cells that we have is the chicken's egg, something we're all familiar with. In that case, the biggest cell known to man should be something along the ostrich's egg. The ostrich's egg comes up to a couple of centimeters, and it is the single largest cell known to man today. And on the other extreme, we have the smallest cell known to man. What do you think is the smallest cell known to man? The smallest cell, as far as we know today, is the bacteria. And do you know how tiny a bacteria is? One single bacteria is the millionth of a meter, or a micrometer as it's called. Can you imagine how unbearably, unimaginably microscopic and tiny a bacteria must be? So there we have the two extremes in cell sizes. The smallest tiny bacteria, which is less than a micrometer in size, and we have the ostrich's egg, which is the single largest cell known to man, which comes up to a couple of centimeters. Now, we've seen when we looked at the elephant and the rat, we saw that the size does not depend on the organism, but on its function. And just like the size of the cell depends on its function, and so too does the shape of the cells. Now, before we talk about the different shapes of cells, I'm going to take you to a short video that will show you the different kinds of cells that we human beings have in our body. And through the different kinds of cells we have in our body, I think you'll get a very clear idea about the diversity in shape and size that we have in the world around us.
Cells have many different shapes and sizes, but at molecular and chemical level, all cells work in a similar manner. They all have a similar master plan or structural organization. To understand the structural organization of a cell, let's compare it with the structural organization of a country. A country has an identity because of its marked international boundary. Movement across this boundary is strictly regulated. In the same way, cells have a well-defined outer plasma membrane that controls the movement of substances across the cell.
Wasn't that a very interesting video? Now, I'm really sure that you enjoyed this video, but I'm going to take you through everything that would be covered in the video one more time. We talked about the different kinds of cells we have in their body and how their specific distinctive shapes have entirely to do with the specific functions that they carry out in the body. We looked at three different kinds of cells, and let's start with the first one. The first cell we looked at was a nerve cell or the neuron. Now, what is the shape of a neuron? A neuron has a branched shape with its big head, branched head, its long, thin body, and the branched endings. Now, what is the function of a neuron in the human body? The nerves, or the neurons which make up the nerves, carry out the function of transmission of messages. It takes messages from the brain to different parts of the body, or from the body back to the brain. So how does this specific shape allow the neuron to carry out this function? Do you see the big branched head area? The neuron takes the messages. It receives messages from here. The message is taken along the long, thin body, and at the dendrites at the end, they are passed along either to the next neuron or to the receivers at the end. So the long branched shape of the neuron assists it in the transmission of messages. Now, what is the next cell that we saw in the human body? We looked at the muscle cell. What is the shape of the muscle cell? The muscle cell is generally spindle shaped. Rather, it is elongated at the two ends. What is the function of the muscular system that we have learned? We have learned that the muscular system assists us in all kinds of movement, whether it is walking or running, jumping, moving my head, my hand, picking up something from the table. All movement is done through the assistance of the muscular system in our body. And the spindle shape of the muscle cells allow the contraction and relaxation, which is through which all movement is resulted. The next cell that we saw in the human body, which we discussed, is the red blood cell. Now the red blood cell, as you can see, is disc-shaped. Before we discuss the function of the red blood cell, let's talk about the function of the circular system, or rather the shape of the circular system. The circular system, as we know, takes oxygen and different nutrients to the entire body. It's like the connecting links of the body. And we also know that the circular system consists of the heart, which is the main organ, and the blood vessels. We have the arteries, we have the veins, and then we have the tiny, thin capillaries. Now, how does the red blood cell, which carries oxygen and other nutrients to the cells, how does the disc shape help in the movement of the red blood cell? Now, the disc shape allows the red blood cell to flow smoothly through the blood vessels, particularly the large veins and arteries, but also through the thin, tiny capillaries. The red blood cells also have the ability to change their shapes to fit into the tiny openings of the capillaries. So we have seen three different kinds of cells in our body and their specificities. We've seen how they shape, each of them have different shapes and different sizes, and how their specific shapes assist in the function that they carry out. And we've seen, as example for this, we've looked at the neurons or the nerve cells, the muscle cells, and the red blood cells. Now, let's move on to the cell itself as a whole. Now, here we have the cell, a very basic structure of the cell. What we're going to talk about here is cell structure. So, when you see a cell, a basic structure of the cell, what is it that strikes you? Now, we see the basic point that strikes most of us is that a cell has three major components. It has the outer layer, a thick inner layer, and a dark, very hard core at the center. Now, this is a structure of the cell. But when you see the structure of a basic cell, what is the idea that comes to your mind? I'll tell you what's the image that comes to my mind. I think when I see the cell, I think of the earth. Remember how we have the thin outer crust, the thick inner layer, and the hard and the rough packed core at the center, with the hard, hot core of the earth. For me, the microscopic cell and the macroscopic earth seem really similar, and somehow these similarities have always fascinated me. Try to think about it, how something microscopic can be connected to something macroscopic. Now let's get back to the cell. When we talk about the cell as a whole, we're going to see about each of these different structures, what they contain, what they're made up of, and how they serve the cell, the different functions that each of these different parts serve the cell. And let's start with the cell membrane. Now, what is a cell membrane? I could give you a detailed introduction to the cell membrane, but I'm sure you'd rather watch the video I have, which will give you a short introduction or a small idea about what the cell membrane is, and the introduction, or rather an idea about the function it carries out as well.
Cells are bounded by a living membrane called the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. Electron microscopic studies have revealed that the plasma membrane is a flexible bilayer structure made up of lipids with protein molecules between them. It allows certain material to enter or exit the cell freely. At the same time, it prevents the movement of many other molecules. Because of this property, the plasma membrane is said to be selectively permeable or semi-permeable. Can you think of a cell whose plasma membrane allows it to engulf all of the food material inside the cell? The answer is amoeba, and this process is called phagocytosis. Some white blood cells in our body are also capable of this. In addition to the plasma membrane, many cells also have a hard and rigid cell wall. It is located outside the plasma membrane. The presence of a cell wall is a defining characteristic of all plants, bacteria, and fungi. The chemical composition of cell wall varies among these groups. For example, in plant cells, the cell wall is mainly composed of a complex carbohydrate, cellulose. The cell wall is dead and allows free movement of any material across the cell.
That's about the cell membrane and the cell wall. Now, I'm pretty sure that you've had more than enough of me for today. So we're going to go through the summary of everything that we've done in today's class. We've seen, first of all, how the cell is the basic functional unit of life, mainly because it is the lowest level of organization at which life exists and at which life processes are carried out. Cells were first observed by Robert Hooke in the year 1665 when he observed cork cells under a microscope. We have seen how cells exhibit a wide variety in shape and size, and that the number of cells varies from organism to organism. For example, unicellular organisms such as amoeba, which has only one cell, to multicellular organisms such as humans or animals, which have trillions of cells in them. And we've seen how some cells are big enough to be seen with the unaided eye. For example, the very common chicken's egg is a very good example, something that we see in our day-to-day life. And we've seen how single-celled or unicellular organisms such as amoeba, which contain only one cell, are able to carry out the entire range of biological functions which multicellular organisms, which contain large number of cells, are able to carry out. Because a single cell performs all the functions that the multicellular organisms carry out through differentiated organs and organ systems. And we've seen that the shapes of the cell are dependent on the functions that they carry out. And we've taken the example of the neurons, of the muscle cells and the red blood cells in our body, and how each of them have distinct shapes that assist in the functions that they carry out. And lastly today, we looked at the cell membrane as the outermost layer of the cell. And we saw that we looked at the characteristics or the properties of the cell membrane. We saw how the cell membrane is a biological membrane that separates the interior of the cell from the exterior. And we saw how the cell membrane is a selectively permeable membrane that allows certain ions or molecules or materials into the cell, while it allows only certain material, unwanted material from the cell outside. And we also saw that the cell membrane or this plasma membrane consists of a phospholipid bilayer, usually with embedded proteins. These are the basic points that we've covered in today's class. But don't go yet, you're not done with me for today, because right now we're going to go into the questions, into the possible questions that you could face from this chapter. You don't need to worry too much about this part, because this particular section of the chapter is not going to give you any big questions. At most, you'll be asked 1 mark questions. You have quite a possibility of 1 mark questions from this chapter. 1 mark questions, definitions, maybe 1 or 2 HOTS questions. You could have multiple choice questions, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 mark questions. We'll discuss some of the most possible questions that you could be faced with from here. Now, the common question, the basic common definitions you could be asked could be, what is a cell? Where you could say that the cell is defined as the basic functional unit of life. Now, if the cell is defined so, then what is a tissue? A tissue, as we've seen, is a group of similar cells performing a specific function. They're a group of similar cells performing a specific function. These could be the basic definitions, or you could also be asked 1 mark questions such as, name the smallest and the largest cell known to man today. In which case, we've talked about the smallest cell being the bacteria and the largest cell being the ostrich egg. These are the 2 different kinds of cells that we have today, that we know today, the smallest and the largest. When you talk about 2 mark questions, you could be asked questions such as justify. You could be asked to justify the statement that the cell is the basic functional unit of life. When you're faced with such a question, your answer should include the fact that the cell is the lowest level of organization at which all biological life processes are carried out, that all living beings at their basic level are made up of cells, and that when you talk about advanced beings or multicellular organisms, it is these cells which make up tissues, organs, organ systems, and the organism. These are the basic points which you should cover, which you should be sure to cover in your answer. I'll go through them 1 more time if you need. You need to mention that the cell is the basic unit of life because it is the smallest or lowest level of organization at which all biological processes are carried out. All life processes are carried out. You should state that the cell, the cellular level, all organisms, all living beings can be broken down to the cellular level, that all living beings are made up of cells. And you could also state how it is these cells which in advanced beings such as any multicellular organism form tissues, which form organs, which form organ systems, which form the organism as a whole. And these are the points that you need to cover about how or why a cell is known as the basic functional unit of life. Or also you could be faced with multiple choice questions such as these, where you could be asked to choose the correct statement about unicellular organisms. A. Tissues work in coordination to perform certain functions. B. Do not require food. C. Respire and reproduce. And D. All unicellular organisms move by cilia. Now, we've seen about the characteristics of unicellular organisms. How, despite having one single cell as their entire body, that one cell is capable of carrying out the entire range of biological functions, which also include respiration and reproduction. So the answer to this question is going to be C, that all unicellular organisms can respire and reproduce. Now, 2 more questions or 3 more questions could include making a sketch of perhaps the human nerve cell and stating its function, in which case you need to make a rough sketch of the human nerve cell, and you have to label the different parts of it, the axon, the dendrite, the head, etc. And then you need to state the function of the human nerve cell. What is the function of the nerve cell? The nerve cell or the neuron carries out the function of transmitting messages from the brain to different parts of the body, or from the body to the brain. This is the basic function of the human nerve cell. Or you could be asked to justify the fact that cells vary in shapes and sizes, in which case an argument of this size is very easy. All you need to do is make a rough sketch of maybe the neuron, the muscle cell, and the red blood cell. And you could state how all these 3 cells are found in the human body, and their varied shapes and sizes prove the fact that cells as a whole vary in shapes and sizes. And you could also be asked questions when we look at the last part of the chapter. We talked about the cell membrane. You could be asked the different characteristics of the cell membrane, which could come as a 3-mark question for you, either a 2-mark question or a 3-mark question. If it comes as a 2-mark question, then you need to give 2 points. The 2 major points, the first of which would be that it's made of a phospholipid bilayer and that it's a semi-permeable membrane. If it comes for 3 marks, you also need to add the point that the cell membrane acts as a form of defense. It keeps the interior of the cell separate from the exterior. So we'll go through the 3 points one more time. What are the 3 major points when it comes to the cell membrane? The first one is that it's made of a phospholipid bilayer. The second, that it's a semi-permeable membrane, which means, as we saw, that it lets in certain substances, while certain substances are allowed to move out. And the third point, in case it's asked as a 3-mark question, could be that the cell membrane acts as a layer of defense. It keeps the interior of the cell separate from the exterior. These are the 3 basic points when it comes to the cell membrane. Or another possible 1-mark question could be, name the 3 species of organism, name the 3 kinds of organisms in which the cell wall exists. In which case the 3 organisms are bacteria, fungi, and plants. They're the only 3 levels of organisms in which the cell wall exists. All other organisms have merely a cell membrane or a plasma membrane. Now, these are some of the most common questions. We've looked at 1-mark questions, we've looked at multiple choice questions, we've looked at a few HOTS, we've looked at possible 2 or 3-mark questions. These are the possible questions that you could be asked from this portion of your chapter. Now, if you have any doubts at all regarding to anything that we've covered in today's class, I want you to get back to me, ask me the questions, drop the questions in my Dropbox, and I will definitely be getting back to you as soon as possible with your answers. Ask questions, keep asking questions, try to know more, find out, enjoy science. Take care, have fun, have a good day. Goodbye.